It's increasingly obvious in the public debate. It's a choice between freedom and socialism. Under the guise of Medicare for all and a Green New Deal, Democrats are embracing the same tired economic theories that have impoverished nations and stifled the liberties of millions.
For the entirety of my adult life, that is the story that conservatives have been trying to tell. That they are the party and movement of freedom, and the other side is the movement of socialism and big government. But that is just about the dumbest, most misleading way to understand what the big fights in American politics are actually about. Here's an example. Take the bright red Republican state of Wyoming, land of freedom-loving libertarians who hate big government, right? Republican lawmakers there have just passed in both houses a law that will basically stop coal-fired plants from going out of business when market forces deem them too costly and inefficient. What one University of Wyoming professor described as a hidden tax on families and workers. Just to be clear, that is a Republican law to prop up coal plants even when they're failing businesses. And to what? Stick it to the libs? Subsidize a failing industry? Isn't it exactly the kind of thing that Republicans call socialism? That phony binary of freedom versus socialism is a ruse. It's a tool that men like Donald Trump and Mike Pence and others use to justify policies that contradict their words, policies that help their friends and harm the people they don't care about. It's the language Republicans use to justify kowtowing to fossil fuel interests and delaying any action on the deathly looming crisis of climate change. It's exactly the argument they use against the Green New Deal, that it is, horror of horrors, socialism.
Booker's talking about Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's bizarre, horrific new piece of legislation.
Which is one of the problems with the Green New Deal is it's the old kind of socialism.
This is a socialist agenda if there ever was one.
It's like a socialist Christmas morning wish list.
This is a real serious threat to our way of life.
Remember, propping up coal-fired power plants with state subsidies and enforcing the power of the state to keep them in business, not socialism. That's freedom. Green New Deal, socialism. Fox News might be freaking out over the Green New Deal, but polling shows it's actually pretty popular among American voters, particularly among young people who potentially have the most to lose as climate change begins to wallop the planet. Here with me now to talk about what we can still do, David Wallace Wells, deputy editor of New York Magazine, the author of an absolute must-read new book. It's called The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming. He was a recent guest on my podcast, Why Is This Happening? All right, David. We have, according to the IPCC report, 12 years to reduce emissions in half. That's the goal of the Green New Deal. Is that, take away the politics and Sean Hannity's ranting, is it a technically possible thing? Can we do it with what the technology we have now?
I think it's possible, but as the UN says, it would require a global mobilization at the scale of World War II against climate. And I don't think we're anywhere near that kind of mobilization now. So I think practically speaking, it's going to be an outside bank shot if we're going to get there.
Meaning that we have, like, we could do it in that it's technically feasible, but the level of resources commitment that would have to be devoted to it is of World War II level.
Well, just there's so many obstacles. There's the political obstacle, there's the cultural obstacle, all the things we'd have to change about our economies, and not just in the U.S., but all around the world. The coordination problem between nations in Europe and Asia and Africa. I mean, the China and U.S. would have to get on the same page about carbon, which we're very far from doing. But technically, yeah, I think it is possible that if the world had a global dictator and that global dictator was singularly focused on reducing carbon in half by 2030, I think it is technically possible. But I should say that the UN has run all of these scenarios about how to keep us below 2 degrees of warming, which is considered the threshold of catastrophe, and many of the island nations of the world consider genocide. And almost none of those scenarios would allow us to get under 2 degrees without what's called negative emissions, which means kind of magical technology that sucks carbon out of the atmosphere. That technology has really been only tested in labs, and we don't know if it would work at scale or how expensive it would be. The UN says we can't stay below the threshold of catastrophe without significant deployment of those technologies. That's where we are.
One of the things I learned from your book and our conversation is 2 degrees has been this threshold for a very long time. That's what we're trying to avoid, that catastrophe. But one of the things you make clear is you think about 20-year-olds who are going to be voting and who are going to be living the duration of their lives, and they're going to turn, 80 in 2080, right? That the difference between 2 degrees and 3 degrees, 3 degrees and 4 degrees is enormous in terms of what it means. It's not just like we're going to miss or get the 2 degree benchmark. every single little bit of warming we add is going to make a huge difference to what life looks like on planet Earth and here in the U.S.
Absolutely. And you think of these numbers, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, they sound like small differences. And 2 degrees itself is going to be quite catastrophic. It would mean many of the biggest cities in India and the Middle East would be lethally hot in summer, which would produce a global climate refugee crisis, perhaps numbering in the 200, 300 million range. The UN says it's possible it could produce 1 billion climate refugees, which is as many people as live in North and South America combined. But if we get all the way to 4 degrees, we're talking about a global GDP that's 20 to 30% smaller than it would be without climate change. That's an impact twice as deep as the Great Depression, and it would be permanent. There'd be parts of the planet that could be hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. We would have twice as much war as we have today. And that's because climate change is not one issue among many. It's not something that only affects parts of the world. It's an all-encompassing threat that is going to have impacts no matter where you live, no matter what kind of life you have, no matter how wealthy you are. And I think that's a realization that is only just beginning to set in, that this is not something that we can escape or plan away from. It is something that will affect all of our lives going forward, even if we manage to quite radically reduce carbon and avert the worst case scenarios.
So that sort of brings us back to what to do about it, right? And the Green New Deal, which I think is the most ambitious program put forward in American politics ever. And there's a talk about the cost, right? One of the things you just said is the cost of doing nothing is going to be catastrophic and unparalleled in civilizational history. Like the cost benefit of investing a huge amount of money right now is obvious.
Yeah, the economic research has really shifted on this. Just a few years ago, the total conventional wisdom was that it might be good in a humanitarian way to take action on climate, but it would also be really expensive. And I think that's one reason why we've had such slow progress on climate, even as we knew it was a looming problem over the last decade or 2 decades. But that conventional wisdom has really flipped. There was a big report, 2018, that found that the global economy could add $26 trillion of wealth by just 2030 by rapidly decarbonizing. I don't think that's yet sort of filtered into the minds of our policymakers, but when it does, I think we're in for a real sea change in perspective. And I think it does fundamentally change the calculus that even the average citizen makes when thinking about this issue, which is just to say we can find a future that is both prosperous and safe from the deepest climate impacts at once. We don't have to be making trade-offs between, say, jobs and climate action. Both of those paths are the same path,
right?
And we should choose to take them. The only reason we wouldn't is out of, as you were just talking about, deference to interests like the coal industry.
Yeah. Yeah, and if we get our act together and invest now, it's a better future in both directions. David Wallace Wells, thank you for your time. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.